This lecture is on colonial women. I want to start off with kind of early accounts from Native American people. When you talk about the white population or kind of this European population, the white perspective coming from the colonists. When the first English came to what will be the colonies, they're going to establish what's known as Jamestown, Virginia. That's going to be your first establishment. Letters coming from that community, from the Jamestown colony. It was really about the men's experience, and it ranged from positive to negative encounters with various tribes in the area. And also the relationships with Native Americans definitely varied. And it really had to do with the English perspective of the Native Americans. Some Englishmen traded with the Native Americans, and when doing so, a lot of the traders, Native American traders were actually women. And so the English, when they traded with Native Americans, some Englishmen didn't want to trade with them at all. They wanted to do business with men. Some figured, well, this is just the way you do it. And so they were more open to trading with the Native American women. And it will actually go to the point where actually some Englishmen will actually establish a relationship with various Native American women, and some of them actually marrying the Native American women. So the relationships just all varied. One example, it's going to be the Pohanta tribe or Powhatan tribe, and you're going to have a woman by the name of Pocahontas, and she intervened and saved the life of John Smith, an English settler. Later on, okay, and I should say that Pocahontas was one of those kind of go-betweens. That was her role within the the Powhatan tribe. Pocahontas was kind of that trader, and she basically dealt with other people between the Powhatan tribe. So that's how Pocahontas is going to come in contact with the English and the Englishmen. Later on, 1614, she'll actually marry another Englishman by the name of John Ralph. She'll actually convert to Christianity, and she'll be later baptized Rebecca. She will change her name Rebecca. And the couple, John and Rebecca, will have one child. A few years into their marriage and after their child is born, Pocahontas and John, or Pocahontas or Rebecca, and John are going to sail to England to actually see his family and meet his family. When she is in England, this is 1617, she will actually become ill and die actually in England. But this is an example of a relationship that occurs between Native American women and the English settlers. Another woman, Mary Musgrove of the Creek tribe, will work extensively with the English settlers, and she will be the go-between between the Creek tribe and the English settlers. And she'll work extensively amongst them, enough that she's known as Mary. So either it's the English referring to her as Mary, or perhaps she changing her name, but she's known as Mary Musgrove. Another example would be Katera Tekawatha. I'm going to spell that for you, Kateri, last name Tekeek. Witha. She is from the Mohawk tribe, and she will actually convert to Catholicism. And this is definitely because of her relationship in dealing with the English settlers. An Englishman by the name of William Byrd. William Byrd spoke highly of the French. And he spoke highly of the French because remember, the French are going to colonize in Canada. And the Englishman William Byrd is going to speak very highly of the French because the French intermarried extensively with the Native Americans. And he will say that this is a very good thing for all. It was a good thing for the French. It was a good thing for the Native American tribes to have this type of relationship, and kind of not only is it a working relationship, but it's definitely this very positive interpersonal relationship. But he'll speak very highly of it. And also when you talk about survival benefits, there's definitely going to be the Native Americans are going to teach the English how to survive. They're going to teach them agriculture. They're going to teach them hunting. They're going to teach them just overall basic survival skills. And definitely the colonists are going to survive in the colonies because of the relationship with the Native Americans. And it was also attributed that the Native Americans have a very high, extensive trading network, which then they're going to involve the colonists into that extensive trading network. And in a sense, it would be beneficial for both because the Native Americans are going to have more opportunities to trade. It's another group of people that they can trade with. Okay, now, so there's that aspect. Now, there's definitely negative aspects from the relationship between the colonists and the Native Americans. It will be said that the colonists used and took advantage of the Native Americans. They used them for what they needed, and they didn't necessarily give back to the Native Americans. They took and used what they could from them for their survival, but in a sense didn't contribute that much to the Native Americans. As I mentioned before, some of the colonist men didn't want to trade with women. They didn't want to have that relationship, and so they saw it as a very negative thing by having to trade with women. They would look down upon the Native Americans because the English didn't understand them. They didn't care to understand them. Native Americans had very different beliefs. They had a very different, they had a different religion. They were polytheistic. The English colonists would be monotheistic. Also, the Native Americans don't believe in possession of land. You live on the land within nature. The English are going to see that you possess land. You own it, that's mine, and this is mine, and this is my boundary, and this is my land. So that's definitely going to be very different way of life. Another thing is that Native American tribes, not all, but many Native American tribes don't have a written language. Everything is oral. And the English didn't understand that. They saw that as negative. They saw it as basically them being illiterate or basically not knowledgeable because they didn't have a written language. But once again, it was just the fact that the English didn't care to understand or view the Native Americans for how they needed to be viewed. And this is definitely a quote from, I don't have a name of this, but this comes from English. The women were regarded as poor creatures who endure all the misfortunes and hardships of life. And that's how they saw women in general, and that's how they saw Native American women. So they didn't look to the Native American women for their skills and the knowledge that they possessed. So that would be another negative thing. Now, when you talk about coming from the Native American perspective, okay, and that's what I want to address right now. First of all, before I get into this, is I want to mention there's not a huge amount of documentation from it. Sometimes it's not recorded, and sometimes they didn't necessarily care to record it, and it sometimes just doesn't go down into American history. So there's definitely going to be not much of it, but a little bit of it that we have, I want to share with you. From the Native American perspective, some will say that it was a negative relationship dealing with the English because they suffered so much. They suffered basically by obtaining diseases, by European diseases. The main diseases that were spread by the English would be smallpox, measles, whooping cough. all of those would be deadly to the Native Americans because they don't have immunity to them. And so you'll actually have hundreds, probably thousands of Native Americans that will die because of their contact with the Native Americans. Another one is that they will say that very little came from the relationship with the English because they didn't, in a sense, the English didn't share that much with them. It was basically take and take from the Native Americans, and they really didn't share that much with the Native Americans back. Some will say that they did learn techniques, and that can be positive or negative. Some people saw that as a positive thing, that they did learn some techniques and adopted techniques from the English, but then other people will say, well, now we have these English techniques in our society, and we don't want those techniques in our society. So it just kind of depends on how you view it. But once again, we have very limited kind of documentation on kind of the perspectives of it, or the relationship between Native American and your English. Okay, now moving away from Native Americans and the experience from Native Americans and moving into the European women in America. Jamestown is going to be settled, and Jamestown is going to be settled by men. Once it is settled and established, Jamestown is settled and established, they're really going to start to bring over women. So in the beginning, when women come over, women will come over in very small amounts. There will be very few women that will come over. It'll be about 1619 when the first women start to come over. These women were definitely seen as potential wives, and it was about bringing the women over so they could basically marry and basically start families, and that's one way to have your colony grow. After the Virginia settlement, you're going to have the Puritan settlement. That is going to be in New England. That will be about 1620. You will have the Mayflower. The Mayflower ship will be the first ship that will go over from England to into what we know as today's Massachusetts. That will be in 1620. And on the Mayflower, there'll be 18 women and 11 girls. When the Mayflower made landfall in Massachusetts, or what we know today as Massachusetts, it was December. It was wintertime in New England. It was very cold, bitterly cold. A lot of snow on the ground. There's not a huge amount of food to eat. And most of the women actually stayed on the ship. They chose to stay on the ship until spring came. And it was very rough. The first few months was very rough for the Puritans overall in general, but definitely on the women. When you talk about the women, as I mentioned, there were 29 females, 18 women, 11 girls, as I had said. And when spring came, only 11 females survived. And that's just due to malnutrition, starvation, disease. So it's definitely a rough start for the Puritan communities. But once the Puritan communities get off a ship and get established in spring, and then they basically spend an entire year there, then they know their colony is going to survive. They figured out how to survive in Massachusetts, and then they'll start to call over for more men and women. More men and women will come over, and the colony of Massachusetts will just take off. And it's a whole lot easier that second year. And then, as I said, they're just going to promote more women coming over just to establish their colony. Okay, now, another thing that we got to talk about in the colonies, just overall in general, is a group of people known as indentured servants. Indentured servants is basically a group of people that are going to work in the colonies. It can be men and women. I'm going to focus on women because of the class. But indentured servants are people that are going to come into the colonies, and they're basically working for a period of time. Now, indentured servants can come, in a sense, from anywhere. At this point in time, they're predominantly coming from England, obviously, because it's English colonies. But you'll get some other indentured servants coming from other European countries. And in actuality, you will get a very small number of indentured servants coming from Africa, very small in number. But I just want you to kind of keep your mind open to the concept that indentured servants don't have to come from one specific country or one specific region. Okay, so indentured servants. This is a PowerPoint. A large amount of women will come over to the colonies as indentured servants. Ages were usually around 18 to 25. That was kind of the major age group that is going to be basically coming over in indentured servants. Most of them did not have a good life, and especially from England, they were basically poor working class, and they knew that that was going to be their life forever in England, and so they saw it as a way to kind of start a new chapter in their life, and maybe they could actually get out of the economic status that they were in. And that's kind of part of the hope and part of the dream. And so when they come over, the deal, they're going to sign a contract with, if you want to call a master or a family that will bring them over. That family will pay for their journey into the Americas, and then that family is going to take care of them for an X amount of period of time. It's on the contract. It's usually anywhere from like 4 to 7 years that you sign off on a contract. That person, that indentured servant, is going to be working basically 24/7 for that time period is on their contract. It is usually hard work. It's all over the place. When you're talking about women, they could be working in the household as domestic servants, cooks, doing seamstress work, taking care of the kids, taking care of the house. But you also might have them working on in the fields if there's like agriculture, or whether it's large scale agriculture, or if it's even like a family farm, smaller scale agriculture, they will be doing that. So there is that potential. So basically they could be doing almost anything under the sun if you think about it. And so you have that. It's a very hard life. There's very few days off whatsoever. The idea is at the end of their service, they're supposed to get a small amount of money. That does not always happen. Okay, and usually people are like, okay, your time is up. Do you want to sign up for another, another 4 years? And they're like, no, thank you. And they're saying, okay, then we're done. It's very rare for the indentured servants actually to be paid after a small fee after their time of service. But once the indentured servants is done with their contract, they are free people, and they are free people to go and do whatever they want to do. They're free to be in the colonies wherever they want to be, and they basically start a life. The idea is that hopefully a woman is going to meet somebody, hopefully somebody higher up in status or economics, and that she'll meet somebody and she can marry, and then she wouldn't have to work for the rest of her life. Does that always happen? No, it does not always happen. Another thing to also keep in mind, by being an indentured servant, especially if you're doing some type of domestic work, you actually might become very good at what you do. And so once you're done with your time of service, you would be able to go out and work for yourself and actually earn a living. You might be a domestic servant, you might be a seamstress, you might be a cook. You might actually be able to open up your own like seamstress shop, okay, that type of thing. So the idea is that they most likely would have a skill that they would be able to support themselves. But once again, the idea is that they're going to meet somebody, a gentleman, and then they would be able to get married, and hopefully that gentleman would be in a different economic strata, and then it would be an easier life for them. But once again, that's not always the given. Indentured servants are definitely going to provide a huge amount of labor source for the colonies, and it will be a strong portion of the labor source for the colonies. And then eventually indentured servants will die out, and then slave labor will move in. But for a period of time, indentured servants is definitely a good form of labor. Another thing is that it's also populating the colonies. You'll have hundreds of people come over as indentured servants. And so indentured servants are definitely providing a labor source, and also it's a way of populating, it's a part of populating the colonies. Okay, women's status in the colonies, and attitudes are going to change from colony to colony. The attitudes are going to change from person to person, and so there's not necessarily one general view of women, but there's definitely an overall, I would say, an overall riding view of women. But know that it depends on the individual, that it might vary a little here and might vary a little there. Earlier in colonial days, men wrote that women had found paradise, that once women came to the colonies, and women were in the colonies to be courted and to be married, and that was to be paradise for women. But that does not always speak about what a woman's life is like in the colonies. It does not speak for the hardships of marriage. It does not speak of the hardships of pregnancy, the hardships of life, of illness and raising the kids, and working very hard just day to day to survive. When you talk about a woman's average age in the colonies, a woman's average age in the colony was 39 years old. And anything after 39, if you're talking about 40s and 50s, actually that was considered to be old for a woman. And once you get into 50s and 60s, that's definitely old, whether you're a man or a woman. So it's not a long lifespan at all. Okay, a group of people we need to talk about are the Puritans. As I mentioned before, the Puritans are going to be the group that's going to settle Massachusetts. And there is a gentleman by the name of Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather is going to be basically one of the leaders of the Puritan community in Massachusetts. He'll do a lot of writing, kind of goes down historically. Cotton Mather will write of the Puritans, "For a woman to be praised is a woman to be married." And that's exactly what life in a Puritan community is about. A woman is to grow up, get married, find a guy, get married, and have kids. And that was it. Women, so having to introduce that, women usually married around 20 to 23 years of age. If a woman did not marry, or a woman that's going to be single until she marries, a single woman is going to live with family members or a male family member to be looked after. And that is until she marries, or it'll be basically for her life. Okay, because really women aren't seen to be able to take care of themselves. So when women do get married, at this point in time in the colonies, whether it does not matter what colony you're in, whether you're in New England colonies or down into the southern colonies, this does not matter. Those women or people that get married, you'll enter into a legal state known as civil death or marital unity. Okay, it's known as civil death or marital unity. This is a PowerPoint or it's a slide on your PowerPoint. Okay, this concept of civil death or marital unity comes from the English law and religious tradition that basically denies legal existence to a married woman. Okay, so this concept is that it comes from English law and religious tradition, which denies legal existence of a married woman. Because by marriage, the husband and wife become one person in law, and the existence of a woman is suspended or incorporated into that of the husband. And that is just automatic. Having said that, okay, men will usually marry actually a little older than women. Men usually marry about 25 to 28 years of age. Men are completely liable for their wives and children. And I will say when men pass away, legally they're supposed to leave 2/3 of their estate to their family. And it's 1/3 that goes to the wife and 1/3 that would go to family members, as in children, most likely their sons. Does that always happen? No, it does not always happen. But legally they're supposed to. And also, even if they do leave that amount and leave like 1/3 to their wife, if they don't have a whole lot of money and they're leaving 1/3 of it, 1/3 of it might not be able to support the wife whatsoever. And the wife had been dependent on the husband. And so the death of a husband can put a huge financial strain onto the wife and the family. And it is actually very common for couples, or I should say men and women, to remarry with the death of their spouse. So there definitely was a lot of blended families and a lot of stepchildren because it was very common, because women definitely needed to be married. It was advantageous for them to be married in society. It was easier for them in society. And also it was almost a need for a husband to take care of them at this point in time. Okay, and when I talk about that, the reason being is that women could not sign contracts, women could not own property, women could not vote or control their earnings. Basically, men were in charge of all of that. A woman's status was known as femme corvée. It's FEMECOVERT. It means femme corvée, it's a French term. It means a woman covered. It is believed that the men would do their best to speak for the woman and had her in his best interest. That does not always equate to be. Now, it could actually very easily be. You could have a marriage and the relationship was actually a very good marriage, and the man could be an extremely good man, and he actually did look out and he did have his best interest when looking at his wife and towards his wife. So it very could be, but it also could be the opposite. And so it just kind of unfortunately all depended on how it played out for the woman. And it didn't always play out well for women. Okay, when you talk about other things, laws. The law described women in one way, but could always kind of change. Just because that is the law, it can morph a little bit here and there, as we will see. Now, having said all this, women definitely possess skills that were essential for the family. But not even getting into that, I mean, a woman is basically essential to a family. You're not going to have a family without a woman, but they're not necessarily concerned with that aspect. They're saying that's like a given. But having said that, women definitely are going to possess skills that were essential for the family to survive. And sometimes women were essential for the family actually to survive some very tough times. Women would do all the things at home, raise the children, do all the home stuff requirements, and then also ran a family business or helped out with a family business, ran or helped out the family farm. And so women were essential to the survival in the colonies. We spoke of this gentleman in the past, once again, William Byrd, who thought very highly of his wife. William Byrd will write of his wife that she was a very civil woman who showed nothing of raggedness or immodesty in her carriage, yet she could carry a gun into the woods, kill a deer, a turkey, or shoot down cattle, or catch and tie a hog, and perform the most manful exercises as well as any man in these parts. So he spoke very highly of her. He speaks of her in a very feminine way, but basically said that she was very strong. She could basically shoot and kill anything and catch anything. So obviously this shows in this relationship that William Byrd sees his wife in a very positive and speaks very highly of her. So, having said that, local courts at times were known to modify legal codes or laws in their decisions. Once again, it was just always hit and miss on how women are going to be treated in the colonies. In some courts in the colonies, women could actually win the right to enter into contracts, to control their earnings, to own land, to own property. There is a woman, for an example, her name is Deborah Moody of Long Island. Deborah Moody of Long Island received a colonial land grant. Another woman would be Elizabeth Diggs of the South. I don't have what colony that she is in, but Elizabeth Diggs possessed a large plantation. She owned 108 slaves and owned a mansion. For a woman to do that, that is definitely out of the norm. Okay. Another one, Margaret Brent of Maryland, owned over 1,000 acres of land. She was a wealthy landowner. And when the governor of Maryland passed away, this is Governor Calvert, she was friends with him. So when the Governor Calvert died, she actually executed his will, which again, once again, is definitely not the norm. Okay, another woman, Katharina Brett of New York, managed her inherited property. So she inherited property and she managed it, and she actually expanded the holdings and built a lucrative gist mill. It's basically a mill. And she did very well, and she was considered to be a wealthy woman. So these are definitely out of the norm, and every once in a while it happens. And every once in a while you have women who are able to kind of push the boundaries, and for whatever reason, society allows it in a sense. So definitely exceptions to the rule. Okay, now, having said all of that, safeguarding a married woman's property. For the most part, very few courts would actually protect property that a woman had brought into marriage. When a woman gets married, that property automatically belongs to the husband. So very few courts would actually protect that property for women. Husbands would control everything and anything that belonged to a woman. And if the husband did not take care of that property, the wife could be left in debt or poverty. Or if the husband just wasn't good with finances, that wife could be left in poverty and in debt. Okay. Some wealthy families / fathers wanted to safeguard their daughters and wanted to make sure their daughters were looked after once they're married, once their daughter's married, and they tried to find ways to basically save or safeguard the money for their daughters. So you will actually see some prenuptial agreements, some prenups that are actually wrote in colonial times, and this was a way for women to actually not lose their property or not lose money within the marriage. This was definitely seen, I would say, more so within the wealthy portion of society. Okay, another example, kind of not of the norm, in New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam is what we would know as the New York colony. This is before the English had the English colony of New York. You had New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam was colonized by the Dutch. And the Dutch, in Dutch culture, women actually had more equality. And in Dutch culture, there was premarital agreements were very commonplace. And so you would see marriage contracts that would give women the legal right to control her own property. Now, when New Amsterdam, controlled by the Dutch, is going to basically lose control of that land, it's now going to be possessed by the English. It will be known as New York, the New York colony. And those Dutch that are living in that colony are now going to be under English control, and women will lose everything. Even if they have a prenuptial agreement under the Dutch, the English very rarely would actually uphold that contract. So the Dutch woman actually would lose basically everything once under control of the English. Okay, as I mentioned before, when a husband died, wives were supposed to get 1/3 of the property, but that did not always happen. And then if they did receive 1/3 of the property, that did not always support them. So you will actually have many women that will be widows that actually have to work or will continue to work to basically support them, to support them in a living, for a living. Under the law, widows could revert to what's known as a femme sole status. Widows, this is once you become a widow, you can revert to a femme sole status, as FEMESOLE STATUS. The femme sole status gave widows the right to own property, sign contracts, and conduct business. Okay, this is something that you would have to do in court, and this is something that the court would have to basically legally give you this status. So in reality, does it happen for everyone? No, it does not, because you have to go through the legal process, and sometimes courts would be more open to it, and sometimes courts might not be as open to it. So that could be a little bit of a hit and miss. But having said that, those that didn't get FemSol status, and some women who were good business or were good business minded, some took advantage of it and ran their businesses and actually expanded their businesses and actually could do quite well for themselves as widows. And so it just once again depended on the woman. Okay, women's work. Okay, women's work was everything. Women's work inside the home was everything. She was expected to do everything. So what does everything mean? Women basically sometimes caught the food. That kind of depended. Sometimes the men would catch the food, but we know Williams Byrd's wife would basically go shoot deer and pigs. And so sometimes women would actually go shoot the food, so they would get the food. They would prepare and process the food. That was definitely them. They would be doing the butchering. They would be doing the cooking, the smoking, the salting, the drying, the pickling, the preserving of food. And then they would be making meals out of it. Okay, they made soap. They fetched water. They warmed the water. They basically got the wool, and sometimes they would be doing the shearing, but they would get the wool. They would basically divide up the wool and basically kind of get it to prepare to be spun. They would then spin it into thread. Then they would weave the thread into cloth. From the cloth, then they would make the clothing. And once you have the clothing, then the women would wash it. So they basically did everything. Women acted as nurses, as midwives. They would act as the morticians. Many women will learn the use of herbs, so herbs will definitely be used extensively. And when you talk about using herbs and the knowledge of herbs, that is coming from Native Americans. They use herbs extensively, and that will definitely come into colonial women. They were there to teach the children. They were also there to make sure that everybody went to church. It's a very religious society at this point in time, and women were supposed to get the family to church and make sure that the family was participating in religious services. Okay, now if that's not enough, women would also very often do kind of side work, if you will. And this was a way to make more money for the family. They would make more butter, and they would sell the butter. They would sell eggs. They would sell thread. They would make more thread and then sell thread. They would make beeswax and then sell the beeswax. Sometimes they would make candles. And all this, the things that I'm talking about, women could actually make decent money, decent side money that they would definitely be bringing into the family because they flat out needed it to survive. In the South, okay, and I'm referring to kind of the wealthy plantation women, they also had a lot to do. It was different. Women would be managers of the home. If you're talking large plantation or very wealthy in the South, you're going to have slaves, you're going to have indentured servants, you're going to have slaves. And so women aren't doing the day-to-day tasks, but they are still very busy. They're managing their home. They're making sure that everything in the house is getting done. They were known as the hostesses. They threw a lot of parties. There were a lot of socials. And they were in charge of those social activities. Many times they were accountants. They kind of had to keep track of the money, especially for the household. They were also known as teachers. They were known as nurses. They were also known as morticians. And so it's doing all that. They probably wouldn't be seeing them, doing the washing or the actual cooking, but they were still very busy. Okay, women's work outside the home. Many women had to work outside the home just to make a living. And so you'll have working women. And so, yes, they still have to take care of their kids. They still have to take care of what's going on in the house, but they actually had to work for a living. What kind of work did they do? They could be butchers, they could be midwives, millers, nurses, printers, managers of taverns, managers of boarding houses, tanners, teachers, upholsterers. There was one other one I was thinking of. Managers of taverns, kind of like shopkeepers, if you will, and just kind of like, in a sense, kind of like running the front of a shop. Like if you had like kind of what we'll consider to be like a grocery store or some type of like general store, you'll a lot of see women like up front, if you will. If they were doing some type of craft, if they were like an upholsterer or a tanner, butcher, something like that, usually the women learned that from their families or perhaps from their husbands. Okay, now, I had mentioned it before, a very popular profession for women was midwifery. Midwifery was extremely popular, and midwives actually could make decent money. Being a midwife definitely required a skill. There was definitely training involved. And once you kind of got established as a midwife, you could actually probably, as for a woman, could actually basically support herself being a midwife. You didn't necessarily do that because usually you were married. But I'm just saying the money that you brought in could basically support a woman. Now, midwifery, why? Because women are feeling more comfortable having a woman, deal with the pregnancy and the childbirth. But another thing is that doctors cost money, and midwives can cost money, but a lot of times you don't pay the midwife as much, or you could get away by paying the midwife in eggs, and basically I'll give you eggs and I'll give you some food, and it was kind of in exchange for services, and of course they're not going to charge as much. But another thing is that doctors weren't always that available, even though if there's our doctors, they're not always available. And so there was always midwives in some type of area or some town, city or town. Another thing is that people don't always trust doctors at this point in time, because just because you go to a doctor because you're sick does not mean you're going to survive, because medicine has a long way to go. And so you don't really, people will associate going with doctors and dying. And so they don't always associate that with midwives. Midwives know a lot more of your herbal medicines and kind of, those kind of homemade remedies and homemade kind of hacks, if you will, that actually do quite well. And so they don't associate that with the midwife. And so midwives, people will go to midwives, yes, for pregnancy and childbirth, but they will also go to midwives if they're sick and they're ill, because they're really looking for that herbal medicine, that type of thing. They might have to pay for it. Once again, it's not as much. Okay, you will also have women referred to as doctors, but are not really doctors. They might be kind of like really experienced midwives, and that now they're just kind of treating almost everything and anything. But women at this point in time are not doctors. But it's just because they do so much medical care at this point in time. Okay, now, other women or examples of women, and these would definitely be like exceptions to the rule. 1660s, there is a woman by the name of Margaret Phillips. Margaret Phillips is out of New York. She will actually, when you talk about work, she will actually engage in a general supply and shipping company. She was experienced in buying and selling furs, and she actually made good money doing it. The woman, Betsy Ross out of Philadelphia. We know Betsy Ross as, sewing the American flag. Betsy Ross, actually, she does do that, but she was an upholsterer. Her husband was an upholsterer. She married an upholsterer, and then he teaches her the trade. And Betsy Ross will actually be very fundamental in running this family business of this upholstery business in Philadelphia. Her husband will pass away before she does, and Betsy Ross will take that upholstery business and will actually expand it after the death of her husband. And she does once again, it's just an example of a woman doing very well in business. Okay, other groups or other things to talk about women in the colonies. You have a group of people. They're known as the Society of Friends, also known as Quakers. This is a group of people that are in England at this point in time. And the Society of Friends is a religious organization in England. And it is not necessarily a well-received religion in England. They do not have an established church. What they do is they go to everybody's houses. Like every Sunday, they go to somebody else's house. They read the Bible. They discuss the Bible. And, they kind of have their kind of religious social time. And then next Sunday, you meet at somebody else's house. And the Society of Friends, also known as Quakers, definitely were not the favorite people in England. And when they felt that pressure. And so when they had the ability to get a land grant, they did so. And the Society of Friends are going to establish Pennsylvania. And so the colony of Pennsylvania will be established by the Quakers Society of Friends. Now, that's important just historically on its own. But what we talk about the Society of Friends or the Quakers for is they have definitely a little bit different view of the world. The Quakers believed in equality. They believed in true equality between men and women, and it was complete true equality. They encouraged women to speak at the meetings. They encouraged women to be educated. They encouraged women to speak and to participate in church meetings. They encouraged women to organize women's associations. Women frequently traveled the colonies speaking about religion. And as I said, they encouraged women to get educated. And they believed whatever a man would do, a woman could do. And whatever a young boy would do, that is what they're going to do for their young women. And so it's seen as a very equal or community of equality. Women are going to supervise children's courtships. They were seen as they did trading. They were seen as traders. And I also want to suggest that as the years go by and as you get into the states and as the years go by in the states, the Quakers, female Quakers and just Quakers in general, are definitely going to play a very large role in the women's rights movement. Many of the leading women in the women's rights movement are going to be Quakers, or they either had that upbringing of a Quaker or somewhere had some relationship with the Quakers some way, shape, or form. Okay, another issue that we have to talk about is divorce. Divorce, according to the courts, according to courts and court records, spousal and child abuse was definitely very frequent. And in general, a husband's role was to correct the women and children and keep them in line. And that could definitely equate to abuse. But when you talk about abuse that endangered a person's safety, that was definitely not okay within the colonies, and that was definitely not tolerated and could be a grounds for divorce. Now, having said that, for women to get a divorce, it was actually very difficult. One of the things they had to prove was basically really bad abuse for them to actually get a divorce. But it was very difficult for women to get a divorce. Men could easily get a divorce, and almost on any grounds, but women definitely had to show a major hardship, especially with abuse or like abandonment. That would be another example for that women could get a divorce. When you talk about divorce, New England and I would say middle colonies, it's still hard to get a divorce, but it could happen. But when you move into the South, it was extremely difficult for a woman to get a divorce. A woman getting a divorce in the South would have to show major physical abuse and basically kind of like risking life abuse. It was extremely difficult to get a divorce in the South. As I said, reasons for divorce would be abuse, non-support, desertion, adultery. But it was basically the biggest ones were desertion, non-support, or abuse for women, and still is extremely difficult to get. Okay. Okay. Some examples, another example of something else going on in the colonies. You're going to have what's known as the Great Awakening. And the Great Awakening is a religious revival in the 1700s. It starts in England and then comes over into the colonies. And you'll see there are these religious services. They're usually outside, they're usually outdoors, and they basically travel through all the colonies, and they're ministers coming over from England. They're basically to get people back into religion again. Religion had kind of gotten a little iffy, kind of people not going to church as much. And so it's a way to get people back into the churches, and it's called the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is the concept that anybody can have a relationship with God. So long as you live a good life, you live a life of piety, do good works, you read the Bible, and you go to church, you can have a relationship with God. And so you have these religious revival services, if you will. The reason why I talk about it here, yes, it's just historic, but you'll see a lot of women be a part of the Great Awakening services. And you see a lot of women being in the audiences, and you'll actually see some women that will actually speak at some of the services, especially the Quakers will come in, the Quaker women will come in and give some speeches at these revival meetings. And you'll actually see a little bit of a shift where you'll see women being praised in these religious revival meetings and services, and women being praised about, they're the ones that are really promoting religion within the families. So this can really put a very positive swing for women and paint women in a very positive way. And you'll also see women participating in the Great Awakening services. All right, that's going to be the end of this lecture. I still have another lecture still in colonial times, but that will be for the next lecture. Have a good day.